Hi everyone! In the first video of today's lessons, we will talk about the types of bilingual education, which correspond to the first reading that we have to cover today in the book of Colin Baker, Foundations of Bilingual Education and Bilingualism, Chapter 10 and 11. I want you to first pause for a second and think about what is the goal of a bilingual education. Which perspective on bilingual education do you advocate? We have talked about the cognitive theories of bilingualism. We have talked about linguistic theories, the linguistic development, the cultural, the identity development of a bilingual student. So do you support a bilingual education, and do you think it is practical for bilingual education to develop in the United States, in China, in France, in Japan, in Spain? So there are a lot of different opinions, different perspectives of educators considering whether to develop a bilingual education within their country, within their school. Some scholars and some educators really advocate for that idea, saying that learning another language is not only learning different words for the same things, but learning another way to think about things. So they say that bilingual education is necessary because it is the regulator of thinking. It actually expands the cognitive ability. It expands the way how a person see things, interpret things, examining things. So it's very beneficial. And a country whose citizen can speak more than one language will have a lot of advantage in a global economy. So if you look at the perspective of the employable abilities, you can say that one language sets you in a corridor for life, but two languages open every door along the way. So that's the reason why there's a lot of international school and bilingual education developed, especially in developing countries, because actually or in Europe, because actually it will encourage a person to work not just only within their country, but they can work or study abroad as well, which make the knowledge become more transferable. However, there are also very strong radical opponents to bilingual education. For example, a perspective can be we should replace bilingual education with immersion in English. So people learn the common language of the country and learn the language of prosperity, not the language of living in a ghetto. So you would think that, oh, it's a very extreme opinion, right? But maybe this person look at the inconveniences if the citizen within one environment cannot communicate effectively with each other. So this population should share the same language as a common ground. And until people are united by speaking one language, do they succeed in their work or their school or their life, right? So if we look at this issue from the issue of bilingual education from another perspective, we'll say that it may be suitable for some contexts, why not becomes so favorable in other contexts. So what are the aims of bilingual education in your country? So we have to specify the environment where a bilingual education policy is implemented, where a bilingual program, bilingual school is open, because this can be different. However, I think one of the mission of a bilingual program can be described as one of the reasons listed in this list. So look at the first reason. The first two aims. What do you think? Yeah, you're right. So the ultimate aim of a bilingual education may be not necessarily really to prepare a student to be good at both languages, right? The start of a bilingual education somehow in the end may be just beneficial for the development of just one language. So think about a lot of immigrants coming to the United States. They may somehow involve in a type of bilingual education at the beginning, but the aim is to let them to assimilate into the mainstream of the society. When the student walk out of the class, they can speak a little bit Chinese, Spanish, or Japanese in the ESL class, but when they go out, they are expected to mingle with English native speakers, with American kids as soon as possible. And that consider the full participation in the community. And they want to assimilate into the native speakers community as soon as possible, so that they can be unified. And it brings the stability and the unity regarding communication in a diversely speaking communities, right? So bilingual education can be a tool for the purpose of assimilation. Now, I want you to compare the first two aims with the rest of the group of the list. You will see that another perspective is not the monolingualism as the result, but the bilingualism as a result. So not just only they can function from concrete concept to abstract concept in both languages, they can produce the communicative speeches in both languages equally. So bilingual education can help serve that purpose as well, to enable people to communicate with the outside world, to provide them for the language skill in both languages so that they can apply it, and for their employment. It can be a way to strengthen and deepen the understanding of language and culture, which is really good science, really good benefits of bilingual education as well. So when we talk about the aims of bilingual education, from the list, I can group the aims of bilingual education into two groups. The first group is a transitional education program. So a transitional bilingual education program is a teaching model with two main focuses. First is to ensure that students master educational content in their primary language, but the final result will be students being able to become fluent in the second language and go into the mainstream education as early as possible. So it's a very contemporary bilingual education. And the aims is the subtractive bilingualism. It's just a tool to help the student to be fluent in the second language only. So, on the contrary, the maintenance bilingual education is to keep the student's skill intact while they learn a new language. So it helps to develop addictive bilingualism, and it helps the student to continue the enrichment of both languages. In addition, the student culture is important to maintain, so the student can feel comfortable learning a new language. However, the degree of being bilingual is a little bit different, so it can be divided into a static maintenance or a developmental enrichment bilingual education. A static maintenance is more focused on the linguistic knowledge and the communicative abilities of a language users, whereas the ambition of an enrichment bilingual education is to train students not just only have the interactive communicative abilities, but also deep thinking and data mining in both languages. In other words, a student in an enrichment bilingual education is expected to demonstrate the abilities to use the second language to analyze abstract concept and specialized knowledge in a specific domain. For example, he can use English in biology and communicate his chemistry, physics knowledge in both languages without having any difficulty to transfer the knowledge. So that is a very strong and a strong type of bilingual education. Now, why is this very important to know the aims of bilingual education? Because if you understand, I can identify the aims of bilingual education, you can understand the language outcomes after the student come out of that bilingual program. What are the expectations? What are the outcomes? And also you can imagine the language used in the classroom and the typical type of the student who enter that bilingual education. So whether it is a monolingual, weak or strong form of bilingual education, they are defined by the typical language outcome among students, basically whether or not the student can become or remain bilingual. In strong form of bilingual education, reading and writing will be conducted in both languages and resulting in biliteracy. On the other hand, if classes are taught mainly in one language, it is not to credit the student's native language. So, children of immigrants or minorities may simply be in transition from their native language or languages to monolingualism in the dominant language of the society. For example, look at this kind of monolingual form of education. You will see that no majority language of the student will be used, right? The majority language in the classroom will depend on the target society that they are living in. So basically, their first language is not developed, but gradually replaced by the second, which is the majority language in this case. So there can be a lot of variations. First of all, there can be mainstreaming and submersion. It means the student just come to the class and sit there and is considered as a native speaker student. The second type is mainstreaming submersion with pull out classes for ESL support. The third one is shelter or structure immersion. And the last one is segregationist. So the aims of the monolingual form of education is just to develop the language skill gradually in the second language so that one day they will not need support anymore. So what is the difference between mainstreaming submersion and shelter structure immersion? The difference will lie in how the teachers teach the class. So for submersion mainstreaming, actually the student mainly kind of have to swim in a new environment by himself or herself, and we assume that one day he or she will catch up. But for the shelter immersion, the teachers are aware that there are some students that may need constant support to understand the content. So the instruction will be shelter. It means the teachers will rephrase the content from the course book with simple syntax, will be an increasing activities of repetition, summary. The teachers will speak slowly, clearly, and frequently check the understanding of the student. So that's the difference between the mainstreaming submersion and the shelter immersion. So obviously we can see that one of the disadvantages, one of the problem with the mainstreaming submersion, the first one in the list, is that there will be no interaction to the native language at all. And then that will result in a negative outcomes of the student, that they have to struggle a lot, especially using English for critical thinking. And they can feel frustrated, they cannot participate in the lesson, and so even can drop out of the school. That is the problem with submersions. And the dangerous thing is that it will be the assimilation of minority speakers. It will look at like a melting pot of facts, of learning facts, but without any scaffolding or support. So compare with mainstreaming submersion with pull-out classes and shelter, the mainstreaming submersion without any scaffolding for students coming from different language backgrounds is very dangerous kind of education. Now, we just go through different types of monolingual forms in the previous slide. I want to make a little bit comparison between I explained the mainstreaming submersion with the mainstreaming submersion called shelter immersion, right? So actually shelter immersion, another word that you may be familiar with, it's called push in class. So now I will compare the shelter structure immersion or the push in class with the mainstreaming submersion, but with pull out class. So pushing it means you let the student to be, mingle with other student from the community, the native speaker student. But for pull out, it means like after class, if English is not their native language, they will need to go to ESL class to study. Or they may spend more time in an ESL with the ESL student, with other English language learners, than the time they spend in a mainstream class. But the time in the ESL class will be reduced if the student abilities in English can increase. if the language in the English increase to a certain standard, they can participate in the mainstream class. So what are the advantages and disadvantages of pull out ESL class and push in class or shelter structure immersion? So the mainstreaming submersion with pull out ESL instruction means that the ESL teacher pull the student out of the general education classroom to work in small group in another room. So with pull out instruction, the English language learners will miss the instruction that takes place in the general education classroom, right? Some ESL teachers pull out the student can result in a mixed level proficiency groups. So while other will pull out and then categorize students according to their proficiency level, like newcomers, beginner, intermediate, or advanced student. So some practitioners believe that teaching to meet the needs of each proficiency level like that will be beneficial. But others will find that the student need that kind of mixed proficiency level so they can scaffold each other and receive a comprehensible input. So we talk about comprehensible input of correction, right? So if the content is just a little bit above the language abilities of students, they can still be able to deduce the meaning and can actually, implicitly learn new vocabs. So ESL pull out is commonly found in areas where students have a variety of language background. And the problem with that kind of ESL support is that it's very difficult to find enough bilingual teachers that can help the student, especially in areas where resources, particularly financials, are limited. So it is also not uncommon to find pull-out program in somewhat homogeneous communities where the assimilationist attitude prevails, although it is certainly not limited to those type of communities. So those classes are very problematic because they just want to release the children from that ESL support as soon as possible, and then just to mingle with the native speakers. So a related program type is the shelter model, in which ESL and content area classes are combined and taught either by an ESL trained subject area teacher or by a team. So these classes are designed to deliver content area instruction in a form that more accessible than the mainstream. So for example, they may use additional materials, bilingual aids, adapted text, so that the student of diverse language background can acquire the content in an easier way. So shelter programs are also assimilationist by nature, right? So push in ESL instruction or shelter immersion will help the teacher to support the English language learners during mini lesson. And so the student can be step-by-step feel that they are supported, and there are different configurations as how to group the English language learner in small groups, even within the class with other native speakers, and then the ESL teachers will come to help. So that would be a kind of collaborative or co-teaching scenario where the ESL teacher instructs side by side with the general classroom teachers. And you will see one of the examples in the assignment later after the video. So he or she will generally call on English language learners so they can get a chance to participate in an oral discussion while she scaffolds the language for them to communicate effectively and move on the language trajectory. So in those cases, the co-teaching is needed to define the new vocabulary, to refine the lesson objective so that other English language learner can catch up with the native speaker student. And there are many ways that the two teachers can collaborate, for example, by conversation before the class or using the Google Docs to plan the lesson ahead, or by email. So there are many ways. So what do you think? What are the advantages and disadvantages of a pull-out ESL class compared with a push-in class, right? I just want to say that in some school they use both. So there is called a hybrid model. So they combine push-in and co-teaching models. At the same time, they also provide additional ESL support or pull-out classes for low proficiency students to support them in small group and with specific instruction, like personalized instruction. So what do you think? Either one of the type or a hybrid model, which one do you support? That can be a question for you to think about. So in the future, if you are working in a program that supports monolingual forms of education for bilinguals, what shall you do as an ESL teachers? So the expert teachers say that there can be some tips. First of all is to collaborate in planning lesson that includes language skill content goals that English language learner need to perform successfully. So there are two different goals, right? Because you are helping with the linguistics, so you have to have linguistic objective. You know, for example, like in this lesson, there will be a lot of like simple past tense. So the linguistic objective is to help students to understand what simple past tense mean. But at the same time, there's also content goals, right? So for example, it will be comprehending a math word problem, that student can be able to understand the word problem and then to use the numbers, the calculation or something like that. So the content goal is different than the language skill goals. Second, the student will learn best in that environment if they can see a lot of good model. So before you are expected the student to perform a task, make sure that you model the practice, or you demonstrate the strategy needed for the student to succeed in performing that task. And another thing is you can let the student to work in small groups after the lesson is delivered. So if time is not allowed, pay attention to the current linguistic proficiency of the students, so you can scaffold them with either conversation or supplementary task. So for example, it's a very difficult task for a language learner, so you will give some supplementary handout, so after they solve the handout, they can understand it and apply it in a higher level of thinking. So, or learning what the quality of a monolingual speech is like. So it means after you paraphrase or you demonstrate, you model the speech, you can ask the student to think and prepare a summary of what you just have said, and then the student retell the instruction, or retell or elaborate their understanding from in their own words. So that in the end, the most important thing is to ensure that the student experiences are valued the same way of those of monolingual students, and then ensure that the bilingual students have enough resources so that they can gradually function well using English with academic tasks. Now move on to the weak form of bilingual education. So why is this called weak form of bilingual education? Because Like I say, if you look at the aim of the language outcome at the far right column, you can see that it will result in relative monolingualism, but now it increased a little bit. It can help the student to have limited bilingualism or static maintenance. Do you remember? Limited bilingualism or static maintenance. So take some time to look at the table and the program, but the more common types of the weak form of bilingual education we can see in the United States is transitional actually, whereas mainstreaming with foreign language teaching is also popular but I don't think in the United States, but it would be like Spanish as a foreign language subject, but it's very popular. I think it's the most popular kind of bilingual education in other countries besides the America, you know, outside America. So what does it mean transitional? So the most popular model of bilingual education in the United States is transitional bilingual education. So it is somewhat in the middle of the continuum of monolingualism and bilingualism, because actually it gradually moves a person from bilingualism towards monolingualism. So to what extent language and literacy skills in the first language are developed in transitional bilingual education is unarguable, delicate matters. So this method of instruction is where content classes of math, science, social study, for example, are taught in the native language. How long? We don't know. But first of all, they will be taught in the native language. And the student will take ESL or some extracurricular classes that are taught in English, of course. But to some class, it will be reserved for their first language. So the goal of this method is still for students to become solely an English-speaking student and to not use their native language. That's the end goal. So this method is typically found in areas where most people do not speak the native language, their first language. So there will be two subcategories of transitional bilingual education. The early access model involves mastering the student's primary language and then exiting out of that language and into a full-time English instruction early on, first grade. So in this model, students receive a majority of their lesson in the second language. So the proportion of the first language will be reduced as soon as possible. However, reading instruction is often delivered in the student's first language, native language, primary language, because reading is a requirement across the curriculum. So at first they will teach it in the first language, so it's easier for students to understand, especially when their English is not that developed. Another is the late access model. So generally, this model delivers less than half of the student instruction in their primary language. Unlike the early access model, more time and attention is given to mastering literacy in the student primary language to support the new learning in the second language. Typically, students spend a greater amount of time, especially in elementary school, to learn their native language. And by middle or high school, the student will gradually increase learning in the second language to full-time English instruction. So they may begin first with Spanish, but end up after high school will be like 100% English only. So that will be transitional. So in the following slide, I will talk more about mainstreaming with the foreign language teaching and how it's different than the transition. So one of the example of the transitional bilingual education program can be also seen on the New York State bilingual education and English as a new language. So English as a new language, you can understand that it's the monolingual form that we discussed before, whereas bilingual education as a weak form in New York State, there are a lot of transitional bilingual education programs available in different districts. Okay, so you can read about its mission, its intention, and how the teaching sequence gonna look like. Now, mainstream with foreign language teaching. It's very simple to understand this concept, like I mentioned earlier in our lecture. So it's properly students just come to class. They can use at first they can use their first language, but not a lot. And then their first language will gradually become just a foreign language uh, subject at school, and it more focused on the linguistic knowledge, and the communicative situation rather than academic context. So academic context is limited in the mainstream education in English, in the target, in the majority language of that society, rather than celebrating the primary language of the student. So, and then vice versa. Like, for example, think about like in China, English is just a foreign language subject, and the mainstream education is mainly in Chinese. Now, so English is not used when the student learn biology, chemistry, or literature in the mainstream education. So that's why mainstream with foreign language teaching is a weak type of bilingual education. Because it does not provide enough exposure and interaction in the second language for students to become a balanced bilingual. So far removed from environments where it would be necessary and rewarding to use the foreign language, it is too little exposure to that foreign language. So think about that. The primary language of the student now become just a foreign language, right? And so why it is just a weak form? Because students cannot get the balanced bilingualism as the ideology, of course, but they can never be balanced, because especially when their critical periods have passed, where the babies could distinguish all the languages and children could attain native like second language pronunciation until age 8, and language could be acquired without much effort until around puberty, right? So think about a situation of a student who's come from Spain when she was like, let's say 3 years old. But then you let her come to school and Spanish just become a foreign language. It means she doesn't have enough exposure to the language. And so her primary language, which is Spanish, will fade away, and it may affect her pronunciation in Spanish as well. So she can also encounter pronunciation challenges, just as an American-born child, right? So, but like I say, the mainstream with foreign language teaching is the possible model of bilingual education in country where English is a second language, or where English is a foreign language, like Japan, Vietnam, China, and even within the United States, you can say with Spanish, like I just give an example, as a foreign language subject. So that is also a popular bilingual education model that we see, a weak form of bilingual education. So let's come to the last part of the lecture today. Why are some programs can be considered the strong form of bilingual education? Yes, you're correct, because the aim in language outcome is the bilingualism and biliteracy. So the first on the list is immersion. So immersion bilingual education has been implemented widely for many years in Canada and adopted by schools in other countries, including the United States. So in immersion bilingual education, the regular curriculum is taught to some extent in the primary language of the student and can be taught as content-based language teaching. So when it comes to the strong form of bilingual education, it means the amount of time for content-based teaching using two languages are divided, and they just different from each other based on the proportion. So for example, the immersion will devote like 40-60, 40% in the first language and 60% in the second, whereas when it comes to dual language, it would be 50-50. 50% of the time would be for first language, 50% for the second language. So basically, if the second language, if the let's say the English, if it is not like divided equally with Spanish, for example, like that, is not considered immersion, strictly speaking, but it would be more like an enrichment. So when it is less than 50%, like if English is just less than 50%, then English will be considered as mainstream with foreign language teaching. So as noted earlier among the weak form, so immersion students did not lose their native level ability in first language, but rather they gain academic ability in their first language as well. And so that will result in cognitive benefit, right, from effective bilingual education program. So they, again, unlike the weak form, the strong form really focus on both both communicative abilities and also content-based instruction. So they result in cognitive development in bilingualism as well. So maintenance bilingual program differs significantly. Maintenance and heritage language, you can see at the second on the current list. It differs significantly from the previous models because in those programs the learner are transitioned into English content classes, but they are constantly given support in their first language, and they also receive language arts in their native language, so that enables them to become literate in the primary language still, okay, and they continue to receive the content area classes in their first language as well, so they become literate in both languages. So it's not assimilationist attitude. This model promotes pluralism. Languages other than English are seen as resources and promote academic learning. And because it promotes the development of two languages, the outcome is absolutely additive bilingualism, which is associated with positive cognitive benefit. Enrichment bilingual education in the United States, called two-way or dual language, involve not only non-native speakers of English, but also native English speakers. So think about that. So if your child is an immigrant, or even your child is American born, they learn together. They not separate or not be labeled like English language learner, no. But they live half Spanish, half English. So even the American born, they don't consider English as their, absolute majority language. No, they can be fluent in both Spanish and English, even though they American-born child, which be the monolingual English native speaker, right? So from the start and the continuing throughout, the learners serve as resources for each other, So that's the thing. So the goal is to have the student of any language background, of both language backgrounds, studying content classes in both languages. So the goal of enrichment bilingual education is pluralistic, of course, the development of biliterate and bilingual individuals. So the outcome of enrichment bilingual programs are additive bilingualism, not just one ethnic group, but for majority and minority speakers. So in order to ensure the balance of the language, several alternatives are possible. So let me see. So for example, classes taught in the morning might be taught in one language, while classes taught in the afternoon might be taught in the other. And it is recommended that the languages switch slot periodically, as students are said to be more alert in the morning. Another possibility is to teach one content class, such as math, in one language first, and then teach the next math class in other language the following semester. So these two possibilities are identified as alternate because languages are alternate by the time or by subject matter. A second approach is known as concurrent, so in which classes are simultaneously taught in both languages in one team teaching approach. So you remember, compare with the monolingual form with the shelter immersion, right? So it's just like the teachers will use English but in a shelter way, but still English. No Spanish, no Mandarin, but in a strong form of bilingual education, a dual language, they can still co-teach, but one teacher teach one language. So the whole math lesson I learn in English, and then the next whole, the first of the class I learn in English, and the last part of the class I learn totally in Mandarin with the same content. So that is the second approach. It's a team teaching approach, where one teacher represents English and the other represents another language. So it is a review technique of concurrent language teaching. One teacher will preview the lesson in his or her language. The other teacher teaches the lesson in other language. The first review the lesson in the first language, and the second come and review the language in the second language. But unfortunately, team teaching of this type can have several drawbacks. Enrichment bilingual education absolutely require a high level of community support and involvement. Also will demand a lot of financial support. And they are more complicated to operate, to set up, to schedule, for student and teacher to attend classes. However, the results are very highly promising. Okay, well, I just summarized the strong forms of bilingual education, and you can see that New York State also have detailed guidelines, and also these dual language programs offer in some districts. So you can learn more about it on the New York State Education website. Final part of the lecture will devote on the applications, and take a closer look at the applications, because this will be useful for you to do the assignment after you watch this lecture. Okay, so for the applications, we'll mainly for this one, it's more like a case study. So make sure that you have the ability to identify the aim of a bilingual education program, as well as how the teachers participate in that kind of program can support the student towards to achieve the aim of the program. So let's try with some case study. This kind of exercise, you can also see it repeat again in your final test. It's more like a case study where you analyze the types of bilingual education with the, compare it with the theory that we just have gone through, the table. Remember the monolingual form, the weak form, and the strong form, was the differences between them, and make sure that you understand the principle, the underlying principle, how those programs are operated. So for example, a case study can be native speakers of Japanese start studying English in the 5th grade of elementary school and several hours a week from junior high school. This is because English as an international language may be valuable for their future study career. So, after you take a look at this case, what do you think? What is the aim of that? What are the two languages that the educators or the policy makers want to focus on? Whereas it will lead towards the biliteracy, bilingualism, or just monolingualism, or limited bilingualism, right? And then in order for a student to support student in that scenario, what should you do? Right? Well, the second case is most Canadians speak English, but people in the province of Quebec are mostly native speakers of French. So Canada has a bilingual and multicultural policy with both English and French as official languages. Many schools in Quebec conduct classes in English at least half of the time. So what rings bell to you? Is that immersion? Or is that dual language program? Okay. Whereas compared with the first case, it's more like a mainstreaming in Japanese with English taught at a foreign language teaching, right? Right. So think about that. And maybe the first case will be more about limited bilingualism. Why? Because the student actually cannot study content areas in English, right? Compared with the second they still can learn French in some subjects. And the proportion, do you think the proportion is really dual language or more like immersion? How about the last case? Mexican immigrants to the United States are often seen as having difficulty in school and adjusting to American society because they speak Spanish. So many of their children are therefore taught in simple English only, right? Or regularly taken out of the mainstream. So if they are taken out, which one of bilingual education you're thinking about? Yes, absolutely. It pulled out ESL class, right? So what is the result? It's more like a monolingual assimilation purposes, right? Yeah, good job. Thank you so much for your listening. Now, before we leave, I just want to explain how you do the assignment. So in the assignment, there will be a questions about you choose one kind of bilingual education and then you analyze it. I want to see some details in your answers. You specify where you specifies how the leaders of the society or the school principal see that type of program, right? So they see the different languages more like a problem or more like a human right of the student that the student deserve to earn for the rest of their education, right? And whether that chosen program that you choose is aimed to change or maintain or develop the native language use of the student. And whereas most of the time in class, in content-based teaching, in academic training, devote to the language of the minority or the language of the majority. And I want also you to analyze whereas the language used in the classroom is more like their native, their second, or the language is considered just as a foreign language. And again, what is the purpose? What is the societal aims? It is for assimilation or it is for separation of the ethnic group from the mainstream, or it is the maintenance of a minority or ethnic language, or it is a way to enrich the language maturity of students, while at the same time they can assimilate, they can fit in really well with the mainstream society. And it encouraged the linguistic diversity and the multiculturalism, right? And I want you to also analyze whether the result of the educational system or outcome is additive, subtractive, or monolingual. And that will give you enough evidence to support whether your chosen example, your chosen case is a strong form, weak form, or not really like it's a monolingual lingual type of bilingual education. And after you evaluate the context, you can also give me the explanation how students learn inside the classroom. So I want you to describe why students developed bilingually or monolingually in that kind of in that kind of program. For example, you can say, oh, it is a subtractive bilingualism because students will learn most of the time the content in English, the majority language used in the mainstream society, and students cannot get any input or interaction in their primary language. So it will be subtractive, right? And I want you to also foresee if any challenges for the teachers, how the teachers can teach, or how the teacher operate or manage the class so that the aim of that bilingual education can be achieved. So thank you so much, and see you in the second lecture.